Dun, 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 dun.
By definition, psychology is the study of behavior and mental processes. So now we're going to break down this definition. So, scientific studying is basically collecting information using the scientific method. Yes, the scientific method, like we learned in the fourth grade, but we use this thing that we learned in fourth grade to carry out experiments, but a little more in depth. The next part of the definition is behavior. Behavior is anything that can be measured or observed. And the last part of the definition is the mental process. Mental processes are what you are thinking and feeling. However, they cannot be observed. Going back to the scientific method, this method begins with curiosity and leads to strict and empirical thinking. So, first, this involves a testable hypothesis that is a specific question that must be asked in a clear and focused way. Next, the operational definition must be stated in terms that can be observed and measured for the experiment. This is a necessary step that is required to gather believable data with a convincing conclusion. This also controls unintentional bias that could exist. A single blind experiment is when the subject is uninformed about the experiment. In a double blind experiment, both the subject and the researcher analyzing the data are uninformed about the experiment. This is used most often when there is an experiment that involves medicine. The next thing we will be discussing is methods of psychological research. First, we have naturalistic observation. Naturalistic observation is where subjects are observed in their natural environment and researchers in their natural environment try not to interfere and to observe their natural behaviors, sort of like aggression. An example of naturalistic observation is ethology, the study of animals in their natural environment. The next thing we have are case studies. Case studies happen when a researcher takes a person and studies all or part of their life history and analyzes it. This is essential in understanding and treating psychological disorders. Next, we have surveys. Surveys are studied in larger groups and are used to measure attitudes and behavior patterns. These are often in the forms of questionnaires and results that counter common beliefs. Surveys are the most common method of psychological research. Next, correlational studies show how variables are statistically related and show how changes in one variable are associated with changes in another. A positive correlation shows a relationship where both variables move in the same direction. A negative correlation shows a relationship that both variables move opposite directions. These relationships can be shown in the visual representation known as a scatter plot. Also, note that correlation does not equal causation. When creating an experiment, there are two very important variables that have to be identified. First, we have the independent variable. The independent variable is what is varied and manipulated by the experimenter. This is what will be changed in the experiment. Next, we have the dependent variable. The dependent variable is what is affected by the independent variable. These are the effects of the change. When doing these experiments, you have to have one group that is not affected by the independent variable. This is very important. This is the control group. On the other hand, we have a group of people that are affected by the independent variable. These group of people are called the experimental group. These people will receive the treatment of the experiment. Now, going further into the roots of psychology, we have Wundt. Wundt is the father of psychology. Wouldn't you like to be my father? Wundt is from Germany and created the first labs for psychological research. The next person we have is William James. James founded the first American psychological lab. The next person we have is G. Stanley Hall. G. Stanley Hall was the first to organize psychology in the United States.
Along with these people come the major perspectives of psychology. The first perspective that we have is the psychoanalytic perspective. Then we have the cognitive perspectives. Then we have the behaviorism perspective. Then we have the humanism perspective. And then the neuroscientific perspective. Going further into detail about the perspectives, the first perspective we have is neuroscience. This perspective says that everything psychological is biological. This has a lot to do with the linguist Sperry. Sperry was a linguist that studied split brain. The next perspective that we have is the psychodynamic perspective. The psychodynamic perspective says that everyone has unconscious forces from their past affecting their present. This perspective was created by Freud. Freud was the first to introduce this perspective. Along with the psychodynamic perspective comes repression. Repression is an attempt made by an individual to push unacceptable behaviors out of their conscious awareness. For the most part, this is done unconsciously. Another asset to the psychodynamic perspective is free association. Free association basically says to say anything that comes to mind. This is used in therapy sessions with psychoanalytic therapists. Along with free association, a psychoanalytic therapist may use dream analysis. Therapists use dream analysis to find unexpressed feelings within a person's dream. The next perspective that we have is the behavioral perspective. This perspective was created by Pavlov with his classical conditioning. We learn that all behavior is taught through Pavlov's dogs. Pavlov's dogs were classically conditioned to salivate to the sound of Pavlov's bell. The next person we have is Watson and little Albert. Who made the baby cry? Wow, Watson. Watson was also studying classical conditioning. He classically conditioned 9-month-old little Albert to be afraid of a rat. He eventually was afraid of anything that was white and furry. The next person that we have is Thorndike. Thorndike studied the law of effect. The law of effect was very similar to classical conditioning. He studied this using animals. The next person we have is Skinner. Skinner studied operant conditioning. Operant conditioning is also very similar to classical conditioning. He studied this using rats and pigeons. The next perspective is humanism. Humanism is a perspective that emphasizes the growth potential of healthy people and the individual's potential for personal growth. This goes along with Maslow's hierarchy of needs. The hierarchy says that physiological needs must come first. This also goes along with the views of Carl Rogers. Carl Rogers was the creator of self-concept. He says how we see ourselves is how we behave. The next thing we're going to talk about is statistics in psychology. This is a normal bell curve. The normal bell curve is a symmetrical, bell-shaped curve that describes the distribution of many different types of data. Most scores fall near the mean, which is the middle. Continuing with statistics in psychology, we have the mean. The mean is the average of a distribution. Add up all the scores and then divide by the number of scores. The next thing we have is the median. The median is the middle score in a distribution. Half of the scores are above it and half of the scores are below it.
Next is the mode. The mode is the most frequently occurring score in a distribution. If the score occurs more than once in a distribution, it has the qualifications to be the mode. The next thing we have is the range. The range is the difference between the highest and the lowest score in a distribution. What you do is you take the highest number in the distribution and the lowest number and subtract them. Continuing, we have the standard deviation. The standard deviation is a computed measure of how much scores vary around the mean score. The standard deviation tells us exactly how much variance there is in a distribution. The percentile rank of a score is the percentage of scores in its frequency distribution that are equal to or lower than it. For example, a test score that is greater than 75% of scores of people taking the test is said to be in the 75th percentile.